My name's Jeff Morley, and you've tuned in to episode 7 of Patch Tales Unknown. Tonight's program is about collectible flap issues from the 1950s through the 70s, and giving it this kind of name of top flaps after the first, because we're not going to be talking about first flaps. We're going to be talking about the ones that came after. And as we get started, I do want to give a shout out to Johnny and Larry. Many of you saw Larry's post that they've been doing this. They invented this idea. They've been doing it for 4 years, and they're heading on to towards their 200th video, which is a remarkable video archive related to our hobby, things related to the Order of the Arrow and other aspects of scouting, not necessarily even Order of the Arrow. So they've made it all possible, and I want to thank you guys for doing that. Let's jump in right now. I want to cover a couple of things that led to the creation of what we're going to see tonight and the start of what we're going to see tonight. And it was based on a couple of conclusions that I observed that over time. And number one was there's a lot of really good flaps out there around the country that were issued 50 to 75 years ago that are not necessarily recorded or cataloged beyond maybe a blue book cataloging. A lot of these flaps are still circulating around at the traderies today. And I think that's an important part of the discussion. They show up at tables. Sometimes it's known what they are, and sometimes it's not. The seller doesn't really know what it is, and the people passing by the table don't really know what they are. Except for certain flaps and certain local areas, nobody knows which of these flaps are the good ones or what they are worth. They have prices on eBay. They have prices on the pricing guides. They have prices on Worth Point, if you can find them, any of those kinds of things. But those prices are not necessarily based on scarcity. That's for sure. So if a great flap or patch comes up from an area or a council or a state that is not collected heavily, then those patches don't get a lot of interest, and they don't price out proportional to how rare they are and how seldomly that they're seen. I consider those to be bargains, by the way. The knowledge has been lost. I notice we have several old-time collectors on the show tonight. And for those of you that aren't old-time OA collectors, once upon a time, a long time ago, we used to have national collectors. And by national collectors, and this is before first flaps or any of that kind of stuff, national collectors collected every patch from every lodge all across the country. And those were the days, though, when lodges only had 2 or 3 or 4 patches. And that has changed. We still have a couple of national collectors. I saw Kirk Doan was on the show tonight. And Kurt may be, one of the last of the big time national collectors, collecting everything from every lodge all over the country. But there used to be more people like him, and there were a lot less patches to collect. And then as the lodges were issuing more and more patches, that sort of became impossible for most people to collect nationally. And starting in the early 1960s, the regional collectors started to develop in the hobby. They put out listings like Deemers in Region 1, Brian Shank in Region 9, some of the Region 12 guys. And so people could collect their own region, and it was a manageable thing at that point in time. When Arapahoe came out in 1978, that was the first picture catalog of a national listing like that, and in a lot of respects, it was the last until Blue Book by John Pennell, OA Images Online.com, when he was doing that, and he created that to take the Blue Book listing and get digitized images and keep the image stuff going. But beyond that, the knowledge just has sort of disappeared for the most part within the hobby. And this is an area, the flaps after the first one, where I want to focus some attention onto for all those that really don't know about that stuff. We have some rules. The rules are not set in stone. They were rules set up to try and make this work. No first flaps are allowed on the list. Not all lodges are represented with a top flap in this presentation. So even though we're going from 1 to 73, that doesn't mean that every lodge number and every lodge name is going to have a representative. And that's because some of the lodges never made really anything that was all that good. Their patches were never restricted. They were traded freely. They circulate around in the hobby today. And even though they're 50 or 60 years old, they're still only worth, $10. So we're going to confine our discussion to the better cut of those flaps and only talk about the ones that, in my initial view going through this, I felt were actually collectible, worth collecting for anyone that actually wanted to try and assemble a collection of top flaps outside of the first ones. Only flaps issued from 1950 to 1979 qualify. We're probably going to have a couple of oldies in there from the late 1940s, but they won't make up the bulk of what we're talking about. Regular issues, chapter flaps, and even perhaps a couple of event flaps do qualify for this list. There aren't too many event flaps, but they're out there, and some of them are from the period, and some of them are very collectible. And we've talked about some of those before, and they're getting more recognition nowadays than they ever used to. We're going to use Blue Book cataloging, say for better or for worse, for all the shortcomings that Blue Book may have, many of which I'm partially to blame for. Blue Book still represents how OA patch collectors talk to each other and how dealers communicate with buyers so that the buyer knows what he's buying and the dealer knows what he's selling. And so that still basically works. And so we'll stick with it for the time being. Mostly issues will be listed, but there are a handful of varieties known that are good for a particular reason from the other varieties. You know, we may take a look at something like an F2 of a lodge, and that has 3 varieties, A, B, and C. And that there might be something about the C variety that's completely different than the A and the B. And we'll talk about that when that happens. There isn't a lot of that, but it does come up. This listing, here's my disclaimer, everybody. This listing is by nature, it's very subjective, and it's the opinions of the author, who I happen to know very well, and who collected these patches nationally between 1966 and 1998, then sold them all off and started over and collected them again for the last 13 years. It's a reliable accounting of what I observed over the time that I was collecting these things, but it's not perfect. And of course, we've introduced the challenge, the expert challenge. into the discussion, and we'll see what that does to shake things up. And finally, before we start looking at the patches, I want to share with you the references that have gone into this. Is not just my own personal observations of going to hundreds of traderies over a 50-year period of time, but I'm a real student of the literature that helps us sort out this stuff. And I just want to list it real quickly. You can see for yourself, this is sort of like a who's who of national listings right here related to the Order of the Arrow hobby. And it can be very, very helpful. We know that the listings aren't perfect and have not been perfect along the way. They get corrected, they get corrupted. There's confusion, things get dropped, things get transposed. We know all that stuff. But when you take a look at it on whole, if it wasn't for this body of reference works that was happening contemporaneously since 1948, we would be lost, just simply lost in trying to understand what was happening with Order of the Arrow patches over time. And then the regional listings. I want to talk very briefly about a couple of them. On top, the two that have stars on them at the top, the Region 3 listing by Ray Garabrandt in 1957. That was the very first printed regional listing, as far as I can tell. And Ray was a member of Lodge 276 in Virginia, which was in Region 3. And he published a history of the Region 3 lodges from Virginia, and showed some patches. And from that, everything else started to develop. The next major guy who most of you have probably never heard of is Brian Schenck. And Brian Schenck was a Texas and Oklahoma collector, and New Mexico. He was a Region 9 collector, and he put out the first regional listing in 1961, and he updated it 6 times between 1961 and 1964. And he was thorough and he was good at cataloging, and he was the person who introduced and developed numbering the different flaps and solids and arrowheads. He developed the F1, F2, F3 system that everybody uses today. And then some of the other great sworn deemers out of Region 1, Jim Adams in 2, Lou Crawford, Region 3. And then Brian Schenck in 1962 also did a Region 5 listing, the very first one, and turned it over to Ed Elm in 1963. And then the list goes on. The Region 9 guys have been way ahead of the game for years with the War Shield, Conley Williams, Hightower Frizzell, Pat Laird, Tracy Messler. These guys were excellent at what they did and have left a record behind for all of us that has shaped the hobby. And then, of course, out west, the Region 12 guys, for which I participated. So here we go. We're going to start to take a look at some patches here. You're going to see the format. It's going to be First Flap style. If you've looked at a First Flaps in Color book lately, or have it on your shelf, we'll talk about the name of the lodge, when the patch is issued that we're talking about, what the description is, what the rating is. We're using a First Flaps style rating. That's a 1 through 10 rating, and 10 is the most scarce and 1 is the most common. And we're not going to see, even though First Flaps has 1s and 2s and 3s all over the place, as well as the 7, 8, 9s, and 10s that everybody knows about and gets excited about if they run across one of those. But a lot of the first flaps are very common, and that's part of what's made them popular. That almost any collector at any level can get in there and get some first flaps. So, and fool around with them and work their way up as they collect over time. Same will be true here with top flaps after the first, except if a flap doesn't really rate a 4, which is an obscure flap, it's probably not going to get into this listing because there's just too many 1s through 3s in the top flap category. We just can never list them all. So let's talk about what's different about this one. Most of you recognize this patch. It's not the first one. The first one has very dark green lettering, kind of looks like this. And then there's this version with this color green lettering, and there's many varieties of it. There's several issues. This is the F3, and the F3 distinguishes itself from all the other ones by the red background on the circle. It's the only one that has a vertically stitched red background. Every other one, including the first flap, has a horizontally stitched background. And this is the least commonly seen of the Unami Lodge 1 Fs. It was a small run, probably an in-betweener. We're going to come across that term, small run. And sometimes they were made at the last minute, these small runs, and they got spread out, even though that they weren't restricted. My recollection of Lodge 1 going way back is they never restricted any of their patches. That just isn't what they did. And that's why they're so common. But this is the one I would collect from Region 1, besides the first flap. Now, some of the lodges, like I said, don't have a representative. Lodge 2 does not. But we're going to see right away, we get into Lodge 3. And there are certain lodges around the country where it seems like almost every patch they made is great. Absolutely great on one level or another. And so Lodge 3 is one of those lodges, just nothing but good flaps in the early days. And so we start with the S2 up on top. It's a cut edge flap. Many of you have this or have seen it. And what you want to be on the lookout for is the blue feathers. The F1, or excuse me, the S1, the first flap, has white feathers and a red number. And the next version of their flap had blue feathers and a red number. And my sense of it is that deserves a 7. We could debate these ratings all day long, just like we did in first flaps. But for our purposes tonight, I'll just share with you what came to mind for me, and then we can debate it all, forever and at the traderies and so forth. The S3, the one that came next, had the white feathers, and it went to a yellow number. This one, in my estimation, is not quite as tough as the S2. Number 6 gives it a most scarce top flap rating, whereas the number 7 gives it an extremely rare top flap rating. And then in 1960, and those are from the mid-50s. Then in 1969, they were already on their rolled edge issues, and they came out with this one with a yellow border and red border, yellow background in 69. And this particular version of it was issued for their 50th anniversary. And they issued it with a yellow number instead of a white number. So you could see this flap at a traderie table, and you could check it out. If it has a white number, it's probably a good flap to pick up if you're interested. If it has the yellow number, it's a very good flap. And you should check it out carefully, particularly if it's underpriced. Our sources and looking through the reference materials say that the S5 was one per year, but the problem was it was only issued 1 year. So it effectively had a weird kind of one per life restriction to it, even though a lot of people say that was never the intent, but that's the way that it worked out. Lodge 3, there's more. Lots of great flaps. The first two Twill flaps are wonderful flaps. The top one is a yellow Twill flap. These are Lion Brother made flap. We're going to talk about Lion Brothers a lot. In lodges 1 through 73, we don't see a lot of gear flaps from those lodges. They start to pick up in lodges higher than that, but we see a few. We don't see a lot of Maritz flaps. We'll see Lion Brothers flaps. We'll see Midwest Swiss manufactured flaps from that era and Chicago embroidery flaps from that era, as well as some of the smaller embroidery manufacturers around the country. The second one down is the F2, and this is a particularly special flap. You'll notice the difference between the F2, which gets a 6 rating, is a rare top flap. You'll notice that the F2 gets a 9. It's an extremely scarce top flap. They did not get around. And the difference between the two, the main difference is, you'll see that the fluffies on the F2, the bottom one, is red, and the tips are blue. And that's just the opposite of the colors of the feathers on the F1. Supposedly, it was restricted to 2 per ordeal. When we talk about restrictions, we go off our reference materials, which are notoriously, let's say, sketchy in terms of whether or not they got it right. And lodges just change their restrictions at will, no matter what it said in the books, making certain easy ones tougher and making certain tough ones easier. The bottom one was issued in 1976 for the bicentennial. And it's not really counted as an event flap, and it wasn't in its era or day either, because it didn't say 1976 on it, did not say bicentennial, but it was clearly a bicentennial flap. And probably the F2, in my estimation, is better than the first flap from Lodge 3. But who would know it? Local guys know this. And national collectors, the few of them that are left, know this. But for the most part, the rest of the country and the flap collectors don't know this. It's not their fault. They haven't had any reference materials to go by. Lodge 4 doesn't make the list. They have a lot of flaps. They're cool. I have a bunch of different ones. Get the first flap if you want to from Lodge 4, and that's about it. Lodge 5 has a wonderful first flap, and this is, in my estimation, the one that qualifies from Lodge 5 from Reading, Pennsylvania, as their top flap. This is the F2. The F2 has a gray rolled edge, as you can see. Now, one of the things that was interesting about the F1 from Lodge 5 is that they used a different totem. Their totem was a wolf head that looks very much like the wolf head on the flap we're looking at right now. But on their first flap, for some reason, they changed the wolf head. And they came out with a totem that to me looks like a Siberian husky. We have a Siberian husky over here at the house, and that's what the totem looks like on the first flap. It's a striking flap, and it's a good one to get. But they didn't have the right totem on it. And so the F2 represents the first time that they actually got their totem, which they had used for years, since the 1920s. They got their totem right on their flap patch, and it's collectible. It's an obscure top flap. You see them here or there, but not often. Worth picking up if you see one and you're so inclined. And now we get into Lodge 7 is the next place we're going over here. And Lodge 7, Nawasapeef out of Chicago, huge lodge. Their flaps from the early days were not restricted. and they don't really have a distinguishing lodge flap. But before their lodge flap came out, which I think was in the mid to late 1950s, some of the chapters over there in Chicago issued flaps since the lodge didn't have one. And these chapter flaps stand out as flaps worth collecting. That short supply. They made it into the collectorate, but national, got to keep in mind, national collectors did not collect chapter flaps for the longest time. They weren't even listed until Blue Book in 2002. So if you had one of these flaps to trade, let's say you weren't from Lodge 7 and you ran across and you got one of these flaps and you wanted to trade it, or you couldn't find anyone who wanted it. And there was no reference material to go to look for it. So these are the three that I like that stand out. I think they're highly collectible. The Naju Amakal chapter, I would give it a 5 rating, moderately rare. Actually, I'd give every one of these a 5 rating. They stack up about the same. The Onondaga chapter, this flap came out. This is the same lodge name as Lodge 516 in New York. And this chapter flap came out before Lodge 516 issued their first flap. So because the cataloging wasn't good back in the 50s, a lot of people thought, well, this was a Lodge 516 first flap. And they had no way of knowing it was actually a Lodge 7 chapter flap. And so because of the attitudes during that time in the day where chapter flaps were not considered collectible per se, unless you were from that lodge, I suppose, because it wasn't a Lodge 516 flap and it was a chapter flap, the national collectors started calling this patch a fake. And it wasn't a fake. It was a real chapter patch. And it's pretty good if you can get one. And then the one on the bottom, the Orenda, I remember when I picked up my first one of these in the early 70s, I had no clue what it was, none whatsoever. But I thought it was totally cool that it had a black lightning bolt on it. So I picked it up. And that one's a 5 too, also, in my opinion. There's a 4th chapter flap from Miami chapter. It's also a cut edge, and it's not quite as good as the 3 I just showed you. The next lodge that has top flaps is Lodge 11, and they've got some good ones. Lodge 11 was one of these lodges. It was based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at one time, and I think it moved to Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, the council office. But it was that part of Pennsylvania, kind of on the eastern part of Pennsylvania. And they did not issue, they were one of the last lodges to issue a lodge flap. They did not issue a lodge flap until 1973. And so the chapters issued patches. And some of them are pretty easy to get. They were traded a lot and around. So you see lots of them around from some of the different chapters. I'm going to show you 4 of them, which I think stand out from all the rest. The top one is the notorious Carlisle District chapter. One of the few times that we actually see a chapter that is named for its district instead of a Indian name or something like, or the name of a totem. And they put it on the flap. This is a beautiful Lion Brothers flap. It's extremely rare and sells accordingly. Even today, when it does occasionally come up on eBay or what have you. The next one down is the Unalaktigo chapter flap. And this is one of those flaps, you look at it and just looking at it, you say to yourself, oh my gosh, that thing is old. That's an old looking flap. And you're right, it is an old looking flap. It's one of the few flaps outside of Lodge 33, Ajipu, which we're going to look at a little bit later, that is an oversized flap. They copied the size of a large 33 Ajipu flap and then made that their flap. They also changed the spelling of their chapter after this flap was made. And so this is the only flap from that chapter that has this spelling of Uniloctigo on it. I think this one is a rare top flap, not quite as tough as the Carlisle, nor is it quite as desirable as the Carlisle. By the way, the Carlisle is very desirable for some reason. People know about it and they like it. And then there's these two flaps that hardly anybody knows about outside of that particular area, the Lenape chapter. These are solids. They date to the 1960s. The top one, the blue bordered one with the brown inner border, was a restricted flap for deal members only, I'm told. And the bottom version with the brown border and the blue inner chain was for vigils and also for the brotherhoods as well. I don't know what the restriction was. They did not get out. You rarely see this flap around. I've given them both an 8. They're scarce. If you catch one at the NOAC Traderie, whether you collect this stuff or not, grab it off the table before anybody else spots it. Now we're going to go on to Lodge 13, which is one of the newer lodges. It started in the early 70s. They started reissuing numbers when lodges were merging. This is from Anaheim, California, which everybody knows is the location of the original Disneyland on the West Coast. And in 1978, as an award, they issued a chenille flap. Now, many lodges have since issued chenille flaps, but this is one of the earliest ones to issue a chenille flap prior to 1980. And they were used as awards, and it was made in very small quantities. So the California collectors have known for a long time that the Lodge 13 C6 is a beast to get. But most people around the rest of the country not really sure how to distinguish this from later issues and other lodges that subsequently issued chenille flaps in the 1980s and the lodge and the 1990s. The next flap that is worth talking about is the Lodge 14 S2 that has the misspelled name. Now, for those of you that collect first flaps, you'll be well versed in this. For those of you that are not first flap collectors, let me share with you how you tell the S1, the first flap, from the S2. If you take a look at the name, the lodge name, Pampapaw, I think might be close to how they pronounce it. And you see on the S2, it's spelled Pampapauch. There's another flap identical to this. This is a Lion Brothers flap, even though it's a little bit larger than their normal Lion Brothers shape. And there's the identical flap, but the lodge name is spelled Pamrap. So the second P has a little R, a little thing right there. And otherwise, the flaps are identical. And so this flap in the hobby has been called a, well, what do they say? It was a reject. They say the lodge got these back and they were misspelled. So they sold them off and they used it as a trading flap. And where the confusion lies is that why was this one given S2 instead of S1? Normally, if you're going to get a design of a flap back from the factory in the first go around and they misspell it, Normally, you correct that on the second version. You don't misspell it, or you don't spell it correctly the first time. And then when you reorder it, then it's misspelled. So there's a part of me, I've never been settled on. Of course, I participated with calling this the S2 back in the day, but I've never been settled with that idea. There's one aspect of this that makes me think, you know what? This is probably the first flap, the misspelled one, and it's the other one that's the second one. But what's done is done. It's said, and it gets a 4. You can still pick these up. It's a nice looking flap to get. Lodge 19 is one of those lodges that in the early days, just every patch, every flap they made was a good one. And up in Schenectady, New York, their first flap is, I can't remember the rating number of it. It's just solid dark green with a buffalo on it and 3 W's. It was pictured in the 1950 Order of the Arrow Handbook. It goes back that far, probably into the late 40s, and that's a good one. But then along the way, they decided to start making flaps like the other lodges that were making flaps were making, with their lodge name, with rolled edges, cut edges, and so forth. And so one by one, they had 3 successive issues from the F1, the F2, and the F3. The F1 is characterized by having a cut edge. The F2 is an oversized flap that has a rolled edge. So it's the same design, but it has a rolled edge. And also, if you can take a look at your screen, if you take a look at this little on the F2, you look at this brown border around this part of the buffalo. And so when we get down here to the F3, you can see there's no little brown border around the tan portion of the buffalo. And the F3 is smaller in size and was also a Lion Brothers manufactured patch. The F1 and 2 are certainly worth a 5 rating as moderately rare. The F4 may be a little bit easier to get, and it is obscure. And now here's a couple we're going to take a look at, and we'll talk about the Lodge 20 first. Some of you may be looking at the Lodge 22 and going, what on earth is a Lodge 22 orange solid with a red border doing on the top flaps list? And I'll tell you what it's doing on the top flaps list. But first, let's talk about the Lodge 20. This was the F2, the second one. The first flap has the arrow going right. It's a pretty tough flap to get as far as first flaps go. Well valued, sells for a few $100s when it sells on eBay, typically. And the F5, excuse me, the F2 is undervalued. It's almost as good as the F1, but it hasn't been collected the same way as the F1 because it's not an F1. And nobody has thought of collecting top flaps after the first flaps. So the demand is lower and these things are still floating around, but it's a 5 and it's moderately rare. Let's talk about the Lodge 22. This is in general, this is a very common flap. There's all versions of it with different colored nails in the horseshoe, red border, black border. This is a flap that today you're lucky to be able to get $4 for. But there was one issue amongst all those that have come out over the years that is really tough to get. And it's this one. And the way that you tell it apart from all of the common ones is you look down here at Chester County and it has these little quotation marks on it. See those quotation marks? That's the one that matters. That's the one that's collectible. I call these kind of flaps sleepers because for you highbrow OA collectors that are on the call and you know who you are, you're very, very knowledgeable. It's flaps just like this that are flying underneath the radar. And you're going, really? There's a good one from Lodge 22? And the answer is yes. Some of you already know that. But yes, this is the one to get. And it's the bargain that you're going to be able to find at Traderies sitting on a table and someone's selling it for 15 bucks. And it's a 5. It's a good one. There'll be other sleepers we're going to see in tonight's presentation. Ones that really surprise you, like what's that doing on the list? Now we go over to Lodge 24. They've issued a lot of Lodge flaps. They're special to the people that earn them. But from a cataloging and collecting point of view, they're relatively common. But a couple of their chapter flaps are good, really good. Now, the Petapan, and we've talked about this on the digital Cracker Barrel before. This is a 10. This stacks up right against every single 10 out of the first flaps group. And it's better than a lot of them. This is an incredibly rare flap and is believed to be the very first chapter to have ever issued a flap. The chapter was located in East New York, next to Brooklyn. And as we've talked about in the past, East New York was a very rough and tumble town back in the 40s and 50s, very blue collar, a hangout for a lot of unsavory types of folks. And scouting was over there and it had its place, to be sure, but it was a different kind of neighborhood, a different kind of town. The NOA Flap is a felt chapter flap from the late 1950s. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't. And there are very few chapter or any flaps that are felt from this period of time. The NOA chapter flap is one of them. Doesn't say Lodge 24 on it. It doesn't say Brooklyn on it. You would have to know that this is from Lodge 24. And they're seldom seen. They're a good buy if you can find them at the Traderie typically, and you wanted to collect them. Now we're going to get into what I consider to be one of the cataloging nightmares and black holes of Order of the Arrow and early flaps. And again, I did my part to make that happen as well. I'm not without blame, along with the other people that have cataloged. And it comes to Lodge 28. The problem with Lodge 28 is that they didn't seem to have very many collectors. It was a small lodge in Kingston, New York. And the collectors, if they had any collectors, they just didn't mix with the rest of the collectors of the day. And so you couldn't get information about Lodge 28 out of anybody. There was nobody reporting their flaps or their issues to the Trader newsletter or any of the books. And so what happened was they would come out with these little runs of patches and they just slipped into obscurity. They fell right through the cracks. And even the national catalogers didn't even know that they were there. And here's an example, and I'm hoping to explain a little bit about this with the S2. It's the S2 that I believe was and now called the S2A of all things. And so this is an S2A technically. It was changed to the A after 2004. Prior to that, it was an S2, which give you a sense of how hard it's been to sort these flaps out. And you'll notice this flap has a green fleur-de-lis on the right-hand side. It came out in the late 1970s. And the first time it was ever listed was in 1996. So it was out there for over 15 years and it was never listed. This one with the fleur-de-lis. It's a Lion Brothers issue. Their S1 did not have the fleur-de-lis. Their S1 was restricted to per life, but they used it for such a long time, the S1, that eventually they started to ease up and get around. In the early 60s or the mid 60s, to try and get an S1 from Lodge 28 was very, very difficult. And so this is sort of a collector's guide to how do I sort this out and what am I looking for over here? Well, the S2B is not Lion Brothers. And if you look over here, and there's different ways to distinguish this, but the arrow is thicker and shorter. The corners are squarer. And this was first listed in 2004. I think there's an S1.5 today, and that's this yellow bordered, yellow fleur-de-lis version of the S2B. That was first listed in 1998, even though it came out much earlier. And then you go all the way to the S10, and that was also listed for the first time in 1998. And these were all made by the same manufacturer. Just the S10 and the S2 have different borders put on them, but otherwise they're all the same. And then it's complicated by the fact that there's a fake. These are Bates fakes we're going to be talking about. These fakes came out in the early 70s or the mid 70s, whatever it was, of some of the best flaps of the day that you couldn't get your hands on. And the Lodge 28 S1 was faked. So everyone is confused as can be about what to do with Lodge 28. But if you keep your eyes open for the Lion Brothers version with the green fleur-de-lis, that's the one that's a rare flap and the one to pick off. If you're paying attention and you want to get some of these, either to collect them or to turn them around and maybe one day make a profit. I don't know. Then there's this flap. This flap, the red bordered flap, it came out in 1971. There's no story, no history on it. We could not get information. When we were doing Blue Book, we knew it was out there. It had never been listed before. And we're scratching our heads and going, this patch, it turns out, has been around for over 20 years, and it didn't get listed. And it came out at the same time as their 25th anniversary round, and is the match also by Lion Brothers for their 25th anniversary flap. So it's hard to say. I'm not prepared to say that this should not be listed as a Y. That listing is going to stick for the time being until we get some better information. But there's equally a chance that this red bordered version was a one-shot, one-year deal for their 25th anniversary. And the people that were around at that time got it, and there weren't many of them. Now let's talk about these two. The top one's from Michigan. It's the Lion Brothers Wolverine patch, really nice looking patch, different from any of the other ones that they ever made, which were red backgrounds with a big white arrowhead on it, and a hand in yellow on the white arrowhead. This is a 5. It was the restricted flap. And for some of you that weren't around then, it was very common in the 60s for some lodges to have 2 flaps simultaneously, what they called their restricted flap and what they called their trading flap. And the restricted flaps sometimes were really pretty good. And I think this one is moderately rare. If you wanted one patch from Lodge 29, you might pick up their first flap, but this would be a close second that you would want to have in your collection. The Lodge 31 from Minnesota, their second flap is, and I'm sorry, I'm looking and I see I have the wrong number here. It should be S2. And so the S2 looks a lot like the S1. The difference is on the S2, the background is very thinly stitched and there's more white in the feather. Some people might call this a variety, but it was listed as a separate issue, and I think it's a 5. It's a moderately rare first flap. Let's talk about Lodge 33 for a second. This is another lodge in the early days that issued great flaps. We know the story. We're very familiar with the design. We know it was the first flap patch, and it had no writing on it and all of that stuff. In the midst of, and the first flap version of it, we call the Explorer Green one because it was pictured in the 48 OA handbook. It had no border. It was just a big piece of cloth that would be crimped around its edges like a crimped merit badge, and the lodge member would sew it onto their flap that way. And it was co-produced with a Twill khaki version as well for scouts. We're still doing research into this lodge. It's starting to look like the original 33 flap goes back further than anyone really ever thought. But they, along the way, they issued some flaps that are really tough to get out. You're looking at these two. You're looking at the khaki with the red rolled edge, and you're looking at the Explorer Green with the red rolled edge. I think these flaps are 9s. They're extremely scarce. The story on them, which may need some further revision and research, but the story was that these were traded at the 1950 National Jamboree. Now, please keep in mind that Lodge 33 from Doylestown, Pennsylvania, was less than an hour's drive from the Jamboree at Valley Forge. And so the airmen from Lodge 33 were able to go over there and visit at will, and these were traded over there with the red rolled edges. I personally have never seen one of these sewn on a uniform, and I personally have never seen one of these sewn on a uniform in a photograph. But they're really cool. I collect them. I have them, and they're really good. And the one on top is really, really good. It's the one on serge or wool. And this is highly prized in that part of the country and in that lodge. And this patch on serge, the version on serge, was believed to have been made for the wool shirts that scouters and scouting professionals and commissioners and scoutmasters and so forth would wear. And this was their flap to go along their uniform. I want to bring your attention to this next one. This is a green twill khaki green 33F, which is in general, it's a first flap. It was listed that way in the WAB book as well, with the Explorer Green one. But this one is different. And the white arrow is pointing to what's different about it. See this arrow shaft? The arrow shaft goes all the way through the fletching. Now, if you go up here to just what we're looking at right here, this arrow shaft stops at the fletching. And that's the way all the other 33Fs in all colors are done, like this one on top, like the F6. The F3 is the only one where the shaft is embroidered through the fletching, and you never see it. You just never see it. I don't even feel comfortable saying to you which issue it really is. It was listed as the F3. We listed as the F3 in Blue Book, but for the first time, by the way, it hadn't previously been listed. But I don't know when it came in between all the other ones. Was it the very first one? Was it the very last one? Was it a short run in the middle? I don't know. And I don't think they, for my friends I've talked to in Lodge 33 and around there, I'm not sure that they have a good feeling about when this came out either. But it's a good flap to get. It's an 8. Let's talk about the Launch 35s from Wichita Falls, Texas. If you were a number collector in the 1960s and 1970s, this was going to be a number that you had trouble getting. You couldn't get a flap from Launch 35. They were restricted one per life. It was enforced. They meant it, and they sort of kept track of it in whatever way that they kept track of it. And they had one of those no trade restrictions, which meant that if you traded it and someone found out, you could get into a lot of trouble about it. And so that was enough incentive for people not to trade their flaps. Now, the first flap is like the one on top. It's like the F1 B and C, but it has a very thick, flat rolled edge, the F1. And that's the one that F1 first flap collectors keep in their collections. But this F2 was the one that finally came right after that, or I should say F1 B and C to be correct. It's not really an F2, it's a variety. But this one came after the F1s were finished. The first flap collectors do not collect this one, but this one with the thinner black border is every bit as good as the first flap. Restricted the same way, and just it's not going to be in as many collections because it hasn't been collected. The next one that's worthy of discussion is the F3. This came out around 1970, according to the Texas collectors. It's the only 35 flap that was ever made by Lion Brothers. And it's distinguished by being the Lion Brothers shape and size. The arrow is shorter. The fletching is smaller. The arrowhead doesn't quite have the barbs on the back. And you can look at a lot of 35 flaps that do not have fleur-de-lis on them, if you can find them. And this would be the hardest one, in my opinion, to find. I gave it a 6. The Lodge 36 Nietzsche, Lodge 36 was always a cool lodge down in Beaumont, Texas. And they didn't issue a lot of flaps. They were a small lodge and a small council, and they've been highly prized by national collectors, and people like this flap. When it comes up, it sells well. This is a flap that sells for what the scarcity is worth, and it has for a long time. I gave it a 5. Let's talk about the Lodge 38 Anali from Galesburg, Illinois. Their first flap is an orange twill, and it's pretty tough. It's a good one to get. And then they came out with their first solid, the S1, in the early 1960s. And they restricted it. This was their second Lodge flap. It replaced the F1. And the restricted version of it is really a pretty good flap to get. It's a top flap, in my estimation. And it was remade a couple of times as an S3. And then it was also remade with a fleur-de-lis on it as an S7 in the 70s. But it's the S1 that's the one I like. And it's 123 millimeters wide for you guys who carry around your patch rulers. None of the other ones that came after it were as wide as this one or had as round corners. They were more Lion Brothers shape, and they're easier to get. They're good flaps, but they're not as good as the first one. From Lodge 41, the Cut Edge F2. This lodge has a great first flap, and it has a great second flap. And the F2 is the great second flap. What's the difference between the F2 and the F1? Well, the easiest way to spot them and tell them apart is that the F2 has very detailed feathering in the eagle, in the wings and the chest and the tail. You can see every feather. And in the F1, you don't have any of that detail. It's just embroidered brown across. And that's the F1. There's a lot of other differences but the one I just shared with you for me is the easiest way to tell them apart. And I have them both, had them before and have them now. And I like the F2 just as much as the F1 because the first flap collectors, by and large, do not collect the F2. You're going to find the F2 is in fewer collections around the country than the F1 is. And then on the bottom here, this is one of those sleepers I told you about, just one of these weird ones. You're looking at this. This is a solid embroidered 41, and it does not have a fleur-de-lis. And for those of you that know your stuff, some of you are probably wondering, what in the world is that doing on the top flaps list? And so I'll tell you what it's doing on the top flaps list. Take a look at this one. It has horizontally stitched white background. So for starters, the other S's with yellow borders have vertically stitched white backgrounds. This is the only one with a yellow, with a horizontal stitched background. And it was also issued with a blue border for Brotherhood and another darker blue border for Vigil. This was the one, the yellow bordered one was for Ordeal members. And so when this came out, it was a one-shot deal. And I don't know if it lasted even through 1 year's Ordeal members and candidates who were able to buy this flap as an Ordeal flap. And then they got scattered to the winds. They just disappeared. You never see it. I gave it a 4, which is sort of at the bottom of the ratings for top flaps. There's a part of me that wants to rate it even higher than that. This was the one you're going to find on the trade or read table, and it's going to be in the $4 box. Now let's talk about one of the well-known classic flaps, the Lodge 43, Delmont Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It came in different colors, and the colors were supposed to match the uniform, so to speak, kind of like Lodge 33, Ajapoo, which was right next door. These two councils were right next door to each other. So here's the first flap is the khaki one with a dark brown cabin. So that's a first flap. We're not going to show that. But here's the top flaps you want for your collection. The Explorer green with the light brown cabin. Most of the Explorer green flaps that you see are going to have the dark brown cabin, and that's a good flap in its own right. It's a co-first flap. It was mentioned in the WOB book along with the khaki green one. But this one with the light brown cabin is extremely rare. It's a 7, much tougher to get. And in my view, it sells for a couple $100 when you see one come up. But in my personal view, I still think it's way undervalued for how scarce it is compared to the other one. Now, the patch in the middle, for those of you that don't know, this is one of the royalty of Order of the Arrow flap patches. This is the 43 blue. It's a blue bud. It's the 43 blue Air Scout flap. And these are as rare as they get. This one gets a 10. It's right at the top there with any of the other 10s, including the 10s that are first flaps, and even the best of them. You take a look at first flaps, and some people say that the 272 Sateen might be the top dog of the first flaps. And there are more 272 Sateens floating around than there are 43 S Blue Air Scout flaps. The one below it is absolutely just as good. This is the silver 43S. Many of you who are seasoned collectors on the call tonight have never seen this one. We're not even sure what the exact circumstances were for how it came out. It might be linked to their 25th anniversary, which I believe was in 1954. And it may have been for officers. I just don't know. I just don't have the information on this one. And I'm not ashamed to say that this is a flap that I do not currently have. And then we take a look at the white ones on top. The white ones are the easiest of the colors to get. The top one is a typical normal 43S white. These are called the Sea Scout flaps to go on the Sea Scout uniform. It gets a 4 just because it's cool. And the one below it, though, is the square cornered white one. And this is the S. The top was the S3. This is the S4. And the one with square corners is significantly more difficult to get than the one with the round corners. And a lot of the S4s with the square corners you're going to see are sewn to white cotton neckerchiefs. So this flap was also worn as a neckerchief patch. Now we come to one on the bottom, this Delmont Lodge 43, common looking Delmont solid. There's probably no one on the call who hasn't seen this flap. And so, so what's the deal here? Well, at some point in the late 1970s, Delmont Lodge went overseas and got a run of patches, flaps for an event or this, that, or the other, whatever it was, from one of the manufacturers in Taiwan or whatever, maybe Ang's embroidery. And they put a yellow border on one of them, and they put a blue border on one of them. And those are relatively common to find for Brotherhood and Vigil. But they made a small amount with red borders on them. And again, this is one of these situations where the red border one were used at a single ordeal, perhaps, or maybe only 2 ordeals for incoming candidates. This was the flap by happenstance that they got, the Asian embroidered one. You can tell it by the funny lettering that's on it. And then they disappeared. Gone. They're just gone. So you can look through so many 43S's and good luck trying to find this one. I gave it a 5. It's a moderately rare flap. And you all who collect this kind of stuff can report back to me and let me know if it was rated too high or rated too low, given its scarcity to actually find the red bordered Asian embroidered 43S. Now let's jump to a couple flaps that are easier for people to swallow. The Lodge 48 Wacpomini flaps. Their first flap is also designed like these two, and it's very wide. It's cut edge, highly prized first flap. People like this flap. They like having it in their collection. And so the second version of it was a narrower, short one, as you see here on the top. And it had very rounded sides. Lodge 48 in those days up in Glens Falls, New York, they had a no trade restriction, and they meant it. Do not trade your flap. And people didn't trade them. The members did not trade them. Very, very tough to get this flap back in the day. And they kept that restriction all the way through the first rolled edge flap. As you see in the middle here, this is the F3. It's the Lion Brothers version. It's a 6 because they still had the restriction. And back in the early and mid 60s, when this was current, you couldn't get it. You just couldn't get it. But then as the 60s went on, the lodge started to soften up on the restriction. And then as they did, they came out with a solid embroidered version of this flap with a solid white squirrel. And by then, they had more or less lifted the no trade restriction. And those Lodge 48 flaps you can get. The two shown here our prize top flaps. And then from Lodge 49, we don't think of much good happening from Lodge 49 in terms of patch scarcity and top flaps. But they do have one chapter flap that's a felt one, as you see down here below, that distinguishes itself from all the others. It's the Appalachian Lenape flap, and it's a cool looking flap. And it was a rare flap. I don't know if it was restricted or what the deal was with it. Certainly in the late 50s and the 60s, when chapter flaps weren't even listed and weren't being collected by anybody, these flaps didn't get around. And today they're hard to find. And I've seen a few over the past couple years, and they bring a good price. I've listed it as a 5, and it deserves it. Let's take a look up. On top is the famous Lodge 51 Black. Now, this is the F3. Their F1 is a rolled edge of this design with a white rolled edge. It has no number on the feet. And then they came out with a cut edge, white cut edge with the number. This is a gear flap. And as an experiment, they decided, let's make it with a black border for the F3, their third version of it. And apparently the F3 came out. They didn't like it. They thought it was too dark on the uniform. And they basically said, we're not going to order this again. What they didn't realize at the time was that they had created a rarity in doing that. And these black 51s, the F3, they're prized in the area. People know they're good. It gets a 7. It's an extremely rare flap. And then you come down to this one, the NOA 1979 from Lodge, Shawnee Lodge. It's not even embroidered. It's printed on cheap material. And you look at this is the F4 that came after the black one. Years went by without a flap. They had solid embroidered flaps in between. They had S's. And then this one came out in 1979, and everybody, national collectors, people like me that were collecting nationally, thought this was a joke when this flap came out. It wasn't embroidered. It was of cheap material. It was a NOA flap, no less. And no one collected NOA flaps. And there weren't many at the time. And NOA flaps were not listed. They weren't listed in Arapahoe for all those years. And it was like, so no one wanted one of these flaps. If you had one of these flaps, I don't know that you could trade it to anybody for anything. It just didn't make it. When your flap was a 12-colored solid embroidered flap that weighed a half a pound, the last thing in the world you were going to do is trade it for one of these Lodge 51 NOA flaps. And what happened is the years went by, these slipped into obscurity. Nobody had them in their collections that weren't from the area or from the lodge. And you can't find them. They're just not around. I gave it an 8, believe it or not. I had a tough time getting this flap in my second collection, in my current collection, when it came time to get these issues. Down here is the Lodge 52 Chanawapi. This is a version of their solid embroidered flap from Lodge from Bismarck, North Dakota. The black border was issued 1 per year, maybe for Brotherhood, or it was restricted in some other way, and they had a trading flap. Not only is this, though, just simple black border, but it has red lettering and a black border, where the trading flap is just the opposite. The trading flap has black lettering and a red border. So I gave this one a 4. This is a pretty good flap. People don't seem all that interested in it, but if it comes time to trying to find one, then you got to start hunting, and you're not necessarily going to come up with one quickly. Now let's take a look at this page, and I want to talk first about the Lodge 58, yellow bordered solid. Lodge 58 from Easton, Pennsylvania. issued a number of flaps of this design, all with red borders. Late in the going, just before they merged in 1969, they came out with this yellow bordered version of the Lodge 58 flap, and it was for a ceremony team. People have said, I'll go with that. And it's a scarce top flap, and it's much better than the first flap from this lodge. The next thing for our New England collectors, and for Rob and Roy Weatherby, I have some stuff for you guys to look at, and I'm sure you might take issue with, or actually validate some of the things that we're talking about now. But the Lodge 59 Caty, which was the first name, if I pronounced it correctly, the F2 is, in my opinion, every bit as good as the F1. The lodge was small. I remember running into contingents from this council at Philmont in 1972 and 1973, where some of the contingent members had them on their shirts 50 years ago, and trying to trade for one of these while it was still current and before it merged, and they just, no way. They all said, if we trade this flap, they're not going to let us back on the bus to go home from Philmont. And so that was the situation with Lodge 59. It was one of the toughest numbers to get even before it merged. And the second run of it was pretty much the same. The first flap came out, it was first listed by Deemers in 1963. And the second flap was first listed in the original Blue Books in 1969. And so the second flap had a shorter tenure than the first flap did. The problem here is there's a fake. And the Bates fake came out in 1979, and they faked this flap, which is sort of a hybrid of the F1 and the F2. And it's a pretty good fake. And so that has hurt the value of all the Caty flaps, and particularly the F2. Now, I don't know, the New England guys, including going all the way back, the New England people have always listed the F1 and the F2 as separate issues. Maybe in hindsight, if they looked at them today, they might list them as varieties, F1A and F1B. It wouldn't change that the patch had two runs and you can distinguish them apart. And so if you're out there hunting, you've got to be able to distinguish the fake. And as much as I hate distinguishing a patch by where the letters are tagged to each other or tagged to the border, as a cataloger, I hate that way of cataloging. But it turns out with the Lodge 59 Caty flaps, the easiest way to tell them apart is where the letters are tagged. The E and the I of Caty is part of that, and the O and the D of Lodge is the quickest way to tell them apart. But I fully admit that's a lousy way to create a description for a patch. And as Roy has shown in a very recent presentation on the Cracker Barrel of chapter flaps, and a very good presentation, the Caty and Tungus and Whippoorwill, all of these small little lodges merged and became Lodge 10. And the chapter flaps kept the original boundaries, I think, is what I think how Roy described it, and just used the designs for their original flaps. And again, as Roy described, they just continued on with their restrictions. Apparently, the mergers of these lodges was not one of brotherly love, let's say, and it was very acrimonious in some respects. And the chapters wanted to keep their autonomy in a certain way. Now, I think if you're a New England collector, you're going to say, or you might be inclined to say, that the Keaton chapter flap is the best of the group. I gave it a 6. And I can tell you, though, that on the West Coast, on the other side of the country, the one of these three that I have seen the fewest of is the Wapunkwok, which was a Lodge 558's design, as the toughest one. But that may just be regional. I'm on the other side of the country. I gave the other 2 flaps, or chapter flaps, as 5s, and they're worth every bit of it. From Lodge 60, Lodge 60 flaps have never been a designer's dream, let's say. They're very simple, and they've kept their designs very simple over the years. But in 1970, they came out with this Brotherhood flap, which was really cool, as you can see. I mean, it had the Region 9 patch on the left. It had the Alamo on the right. It had this great arrowhead and feathers and arrow, whatever. Really cool. It's a Brotherhood flap. It was restricted. It's the one to get. It's much better than the first flap, in my opinion. And I gave it a 4. It's obscure, but it's the one that I'd want to have to represent Lodge 60. Coming up, Lodge 62 from Port Arthur, Texas, was the lodge. The other lodge. Their first flap looks just like these two, except it has a cut edge, maybe a darker red background, and it's a good first flap. People like it. And then the next one was the rolled edge, the F2, and it's basically the F1, maybe a brighter, lighter twill red background and a rolled edge. I gave it a 4. You can find them if you want them, and they do pretty well. They're solids. They're fully embroidered flaps. Potentially could almost be on this list. I didn't put them on the list, but they really could be on this list because people like them so much. They're in such high demand. They're just not that rare. And so I don't know. We'll see about that. We'll see what people say. If the Lodge 62 solid embroidered flaps should be on the top flaps list, because they often sell for more than $100. The bottom Lodge 62, you'll notice that what's yellow on the F2 above it is now gold mylar on the F3. This is an extremely rare and scarce flap, extremely scarce. We don't really know exactly what the purpose of it was. The Texas collectors have accepted this as an issue from Lodge 62, but no one's ever produced documentation, hard document, not hearsay, mind you, hard documentation of what was going on with this flap. And I do want to say, and I'm willing to go with the Texas collectors, of course, because I really respect how they go about doing things and what they've done for the hobby. But Brian Schenck, the godfather of cataloging, this was right in his wheelhouse. He was cataloging Texas and had 6 different updated versions of Texas issues between 1961 and 1964. And that's right when this gold mylar flap came out. And Brian Schenck did not ever list this flap with the gold mylar. And we have to wonder, he didn't list it for a reason. And maybe the reason was he never saw it. I don't know. He's not around anymore to ask. But it wasn't part of the Region 9 listings. We're getting closer to the end of our top flaps list for tonight. And let's talk about these. And the one on top, I just had to throw in another, what in the world is this doing on the top flaps list? This Scanando Lodge 64 flap. And the answer is, this one is moderately rare. It's hard to find. They have two other flaps, an F2 and an F3 that are of similar design with different colored backgrounds. One has a blue border and a gray background. The other one has a light green twill and so forth. You could look at Lodge 64Fs all day long at the traderies, and you're probably not going to see this one. I don't know why. There's no story on it. Maybe it was a short run. Maybe it was one of these weird ones that was just used for one ordeal, group of ordeals, one year, and that was the end. I don't know. It's not around. It's a top flap, and you wouldn't think so. The Lodge 65, this is their restricted flap that came out after their first flap in the mid 1960s. And it's distinguished from the trading flap, which is the S2, by the fact that it does not have a big raccoon paw on the right-hand side. The trading flap has that big paw on the right-hand side and a smaller raccoon, and some other things are moved around. And that's the difference between the two of them. But the restricted flap is a decent flap. I gave it a 5, and it's a decent flap. Now we see the 66W2, the one that's spelled, as you see with the white arrow, it's spelled H-E-Y, Yata-Hay, Yata-Hay. It's always been confusing on the spelling of this lodge. We look up here, was it Yata-Nay or was it Yata-Hay? The first flap, the W1, was spelled N-E-Y, but this is a single example in first flaps. I think it's the only one where we listed the W1 and the W2 as first flaps. We listed them both as first flaps. The Texas collectors consider these to be all one lodge and not two different lodges. So one lodge can't have two different first flaps. And so it's the W1 that's the first flap, and the one spelled H-E-Y is the second flap. And it's better. It's better than the one spelled the other way. And now we're going to round out the list with a group of flaps that everybody can agree with. We've gotten past the sleepers. We've gotten past the oddballs. We've gotten past the quirky cataloging problems of Lodge 28 and the fakes of Lodge 59. We get past all that stuff. And now you're looking at 3 flaps that are not controversial in any way. The Lodge 69s, you're looking at the F2 and the first solid, which was the last of the Lodge 69 flaps. The F1 of Lodge 69, of course, looks identical to the F2. The F2 and the solid are Maritz flaps, and so is the F1. The F1, in place of the WWW on the F1, it says 1933, right there where the lodge where the flap had the lodge charter date. People love this flap. The collectors love this flap. This is one that sells for more and is in more demand than its scarcity might indicate. And that's because the demand for this flap is as much for the design, the novelty, and the beauty of it in some fashion as it is for the scarcity. The S1 was the last of them. And the S1 is probably the best of them all. I think that the S1 is rarer than the first flap. Other first flap collectors might have a different opinion of that. But the S1 had the shortest tenure, and in my opinion, is the one that's the most difficult to get. For most collectors around the country, if they're going to have any Lodge 69 flap from Mazashaw, they're going to have the F2. This one up on top. That's the one they'll have in their collection. And then finally, we've got the Sinawa Lodge 73. This is the S2. It's a remake of the S1. The S1 looks very much like this flap. except if you take a look at the W's on the S2, notice how the outer legs of the W's go all the way to where the middle legs go. And on the S1, the middle of the W's is shorter. It's down below. There are other differences between the two. This is the fastest way to look at it. And the S2 is restricted like the S1. They were one per life, is a really small council, Manitowoc, Wisconsin, way up there on the lake. And you couldn't get these. This was a good number. 73 has always been a good number. And they only had the two flaps. In another world, and today, they might have been the S1 and the S2 might have been varieties of each other, but that isn't the way it worked out. And so we know them as the S1 and the S2, and the S2 is every bit a top flap. I gave it a 7. So we've reached the end of the trail, so to speak, on this version of Top Flaps. And I'm Jeff Morley. You've been watching Patch Tales Unknown, and I do hope to see you back for a continuation of this series, of the Top Flap series, and for other Patch Tales Unknowns and the digital Cracker Barrel itself, which I think is one of the cool things we have in the hobby to participate in. So thank you very much. Do you happen to know, or did Tracy specify, when he's talking about the F2, is he talking about the F1, B, or C, or is he talking about the F2 that they listed in War Shield as the Lion Brothers version? The War Shield, the Region 9 book, for a lot of their lodges, they had their own version of the listings and didn't necessarily follow the National Blue Book listings. So the F2 that Tracy is referring to is the Lion Brothers version of the flap. Yeah, so I think as far as the game is concerned, we have a couple successful challenges here. And yeah, and we have a couple of, like, from the Lodge 3, they're just confirming what we already knew. But yeah, and so we'll have to take a closer look at those Lodge 25s and think about how it's all sorted out, and maybe even get better information on the different ones. And the Lodge 8 gold border, I think, is also a successful challenge.
Yeah, I'm not going to throw a challenge flag, because the patch that I would have included that you didn't is really a Q issue, and that's the Sasakis QS1, which was a Lodge reject. There's only a few of them known, but it is a gorgeous flap that is very, very, very difficult. So it's not really a challenge, but I surely would have counted that one among my rarest, but it really doesn't fit within the top flaps. And I would, and by the way, on the Elowok chapter flaps from Kiaton chapter, the Kiaton chapter F1, the Tunxis chapter S1, and the Wapunkwik chapter S1, they all did come out in that first year after the merger in 73. They probably all came out in 73.
Wapunkwik has a plastic back and is later than the others.
Say what?
The Wapunkwik has a plastic back and was later than the others.
I was in Wapunkwik chapter in 1973, and that's when it came out.
So, I'm killing myself on that stupid 79 shiny.
But those three chapter flaps, the Wapunkwik is far easier to find than the other two.
In New England,
we were a way bigger lot in the 5 lodge merger. Wapunkwik was far larger than the other lodges. Tunxis out of Torrington was very small, and Kiaton out of Middletown was also very small.
So I'd like to hear, Rob, if you don't mind, I'd like to hear your take, and then Roy's take right after. Rank the three chapter flaps best to
Kiaton I
Number
think
one.
by far the toughest of the three.
Yeah.
Tungus is pretty difficult, but not as difficult as the first Keaton. And
Yeah.
the Wapunkwak is pretty easy.
Oh, okay.
I mean, they may not be findable now because it's been so many years. I mean, it's been
Right.
over 50 years,
It's 50
but
years.
nonetheless, they were far more accessible than the other two.
Okay. And Roy?
Well, I agree with the ranking that Rob gave. The Wapunkwak's common. I've got a handful of them.
Okay.
in due. Nothing special there. The Keaton chapter flap was one per life, just like the lodge flaps, and the guys protesting the merger or whatever would sew them on their uniform. All the ones that I saw for years and years and years were used or still being worn on uniforms.
Wow.
And it took me forever to find a mint one. It was harder to find a mint chapter flap than it was either of the two lodge flaps.
Okay.
And they put out what, 3 different chapter flap issues over time in Keaton? I'm trying to remember.
Over time, there's at least 4, but the others are much later.
Yeah. Oh yeah, much later. But I mean, they continued that whole notion of, you know, we're a chapter, we're going to wear our chapter flap.
Yeah.
The others sort of folded, I think, in their concerns. The guys out of Torrington, the Tungus chapter guys, you know, their camp was Camp Workomen, and the council tried to shut down Camp Workomen, and they were apoplectic and kept the camp open. Now the camp is open now, but the camp is no longer a summer camp. The camp is an event camp and a training camp, but they had a very strong opinion.
Okay.
You know, it was not an easy merger. It really wasn't. Easy is always comparatively so, right? You know, and it's, you know, it's 50 years down the line now. That's the thing. Finding things that have, as Jeff has mentioned, has been dispersed into the winds over the years. You know, so many things that we think of, if we've been around as long as we have, as being easy, aren't so easy nowadays to find.
Nope. And some things that used to be tough have loosened up.
That's true too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Thank
from
you.
Sasakis, apart from the Q, their top flap I would rank as their 10th anniversary, but it falls 3 years outside of your date window there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And I was credited as being one of the 2 people who designed that ugly thing. I have one on a plaque thanking me for designing it. It's one of those. I kind of hide it because it's such an ugly flap, but it is a very difficult flap to find.
But it is.
It came out at the lodge banquet, and they were all sold at the lodge banquet. Banquet, and they're gone.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you, it wasn't random or a coincidence that I stopped the top flap rating at 1979 because once 2 things happened in 1980 that changed flaps for the guys that were around. They may remember all too well. The first was NOA flaps started coming out in 1979. A few had come out before then, but by 1979, a lot of lodges were now making NOA flaps, and that changed how we had to look at event flaps. And there was a trickle down effect of that over the next 20 years. And the second thing is, for whatever reason, in 1980, there were a lot of restricted and weird flaps coming out, anniversary issues and other things that were very tough, like you guys mentioned. And so that'll be left for somebody else to sort out one day, if it ever gets sorted out, you know, the post 1980 through 2000 flaps and so forth.